both read for like 5-ish, a bit longer than 5-ish, I don't know. And then we'll talk. Yeah, and we'll start. Okay, sounds good. Perfect. Thank you to everyone for being here tonight, spending your Tuesday night with us. I'm going to read from the first story of my collection, Tombs Weaving. It's called Unknown by Unknown, and will be about 5 minutes. When I'd gotten laid off, the manager said it had nothing to do with my performance. They had purchased a piece of software that could do my job at 1,000 times the speed. There was no way I could compete, and they were very sorry. They offered me a month of severance for every year I had been at the company, 7 months of pay. I had joined when I was still considered a young woman, 27, at the cusp of my late 20s. Now I was very much in my 30s, jobless, with nothing tying me to the place where I lived, besides the one-bedroom apartment I rented that still had 10 months on the lease. I wasn't hurting for money yet, but I was bored and growing increasingly anxious. I suspected I should be doing more with my time than eating weed gummies and lying in bed, binge-watching reality dating shows with heinous, hilarious names like Simp Island and From Stalker to Lover. The shows made me certain I would die alone. It wasn't necessarily the most frightening thought, since I liked being alone, but it was the first time in my life that I had the time to meditate on my mortality, on how everything I had spent the last 7 years doing, focusing on my career, developing my independence, saving my money for some future better life, had been ultimately meaningless. And it stirred inside me feelings I had difficulty understanding, let alone managing. 2 months into unemployed life, a former coworker took pity on me. He texted to ask if I would be open to a month-long house and pet sitting job for friends of his family, who were having a hard time finding somebody they could trust, and I assumed had the free time in their schedule. The only requirement, a video interview with the owners of the house. The work acquaintance suspected was more a formality. He had already told them I was a perfect fit. I had been perceived as competent at my previous job. I listened, I didn't fuss, I fixed other people's mistakes. The proposal of escape into someone else's home, someone else's life, appealed to me. Over video chat, I caught my first glimpses of the house's interior. A modernist chandelier hung in the background. There was a hint of a giant fiddle leaf bay, a few large paintings on the walls. It was a pixelated and glitchy mess. The internet connection was weak at the house. We're up in the most beautiful, secluded hills, said the owners. They were a nice-looking white couple in their 50s, artists and art collectors with a dog named Georgia, after Georgia O'Keeffe, of course, and would be going on a, quote, long-needed inspirational trip to Portugal now that travel had reopened. They warned that not only did they have limited internet access, but phone service could be challenging too. They had a landline I could use, thousands of satellite TV channels, and a vast collection of DVDs and records. You won't be left wanting, they promised. They went into great detail about the intricacies of the house, attempting to point their iPad's camera at the kitchen sink, the guest bedrooms, I could choose from 3, the husband's recording studio full of instruments, hobbyist only, I was welcome to use, the wife's painting studio, please don't disturb, their meditation room, the deck hot tub, the backyard swimming pool, the indoor fireplace, the outdoor fire pit. I wasn't able to make out much beyond the outlines of items frozen on the screen, and the owners' voices often cut out. It was, however, clear how beautiful the place would be in person, how it would be an escape from my living situation, an escape from the stomping of the neighbors in the upstairs apartment, the sirens of passing ambulances and fire trucks, the strange smell emanating from beneath the kitchen sink, the persistent hum coming from some unknown part of the building. I nodded and took notes while the owners talked. They liked that. I could see the digital jerks of their nodding heads, their disjointed smiles through the screen. They told me I was wonderful, something I hadn't heard in a long time. I was susceptible to praise. I felt a warmth rise up from my legs into my chest, the sense that my life was back on its intended path. They asked me to promise that I would take the very best care of their home and dog, and most of all, they hoped I would benefit from the space, which they called euphemistically, quote, a beautiful retreat from the world's increasing chaos. I had never been on a retreat, let alone worked a job described as a retreat. I told Catherine and Eric, those were their names, that I would be most appreciative of the opportunity. And I'll end there.
So we realized that we're both reading stories about the house. I'm going to read a story called Aren't We Lucky? And I'm going to pick up kind of 2 pages into it. So there's a family, 2 parents and their adult daughters who are twins. The story is following the perspective of one twin, Emma. Her sister Nora is infinitely more smart alecky than she is. And their parents are doing a home renovation. So there's been, in this part of the story so far, a lot of things being thrown out windows into dumpsters, and rooms being gutted, things like that. Okay. Downstairs, sun through the window makes 4 bright squares across the countertops. Their father makes a late lunch of chicken salad on toast. Their mother joins them, still wearing her sleeveless yoga tank top, which shows the soft skin of her shoulders. Nora lifts the bread from her sandwich, as if preparing to clean the entrails from something she has personally killed. She begins to grind pepper over the meat, but then the hammering recommences upstairs, and she pauses, holding the pepper grinder with gentle authority, a picture of tolerant forbearance, like someone in a portrait bearing a scepter. Her hand clasps the curvature of the wood. I'm going insane, says their mother, looking at the ceiling. She turns the tap on the sink and begins to wash their hands. Mom, says Nora, I think you're actually okay. Emma sees something ominous flicker in their mother's features, but Nora doesn't notice as she turns and turns the pepper grinder's head, a manic, provocative sound. Their mother's nostrils dilate. Her mouth makes a little expression of derision, like she's affirming to herself she'll give this remark no actual consideration. Thank you, Nora, says their mother. That's a very good point. Another hunk of ceramic hurtles past the window and hits the dumpster with a thud. Emma flinches. She has the breathless, potent sense of being pursued, but Nora is unfazed. You know, that could have hit any one of us when you think about it, she says, gesturing out the window, breezy and knowledgeable, as their father might have sounded once, making some conceptual explanation to them as children. The rules of baseball, the virtues of capitalism, the phases of the moon. Nora says, scary, right? She widens her eyes for emphasis. Nora, says their mother, in her most clipped, efficient tone, we're indoors. It could not possibly have hit any of us. She reaches to move a strand of Nora's hair back into place, as if Nora has some piece of inner machinery short-circuiting. But Nora can't be stopped. Okay, but if we were outside, she says, then it could have hit any of us. Like, let's have some perspective. We're so lucky. Everything's great when you think about it that way. Their father says, when you think about not being hit by a flying sink. Emma feels horrified laughter rising in her chest. Walk me through this, their mother is saying. Where are we all standing in this hypothetical? Are we inside the dumpster? To prove her point, she looks out the window at where the sink has crash landed well within the bounds of the massive receptacle. Nora shrugs, sure. And their mother looks triumphant. Well, I can't think why we would ever do that, but you should, of course, feel free to enlighten me. At this, Nora meets Emma's eye, and Emma feels herself go still, instinctive as a deer or rabbit. Nora smiles. Emma or I could have been in there processing our feelings about our childhood, she says, without equal triumph in her voice. I mean, that dumpster is full of interesting stuff. It's the detritus of our dismantled family home. Talk about symbolic. Their father laughs, as if in spite of himself. Careful, Emma says, because Nora's half sandwich is starting to come apart in her grasp. Nora, says their mother, drying her hands on a towel. It's plumbing and floor tile, and you had a lovely childhood. I'm not sure what you need to process. Suddenly, precisely, their father deposits his plate in the sink. I think I would like to take a nap, he says. The hammering intensifies as if on cue, and in the orchestral swell, he stops to recalibrate, disorienting, seeming to reconcile the cacophony with the location of his bed. Their mother is saying, adamant, I have no reason to think you or Emma would climb into a dumpster during active demolition. She moves their father's plate to the dishwasher, then Emma's, then Norma's. She says, he never struck me as stupid. Nora shrugs again, and she takes Emma by the arm. Let's take a walk, she says brightly, and they leave their parents in the kitchen, amidst what sounds like a house beginning to fall in on itself. They sit together on the porch, they lace their sneakers in the cold wind. Those are nice, Nora says, nodding at Emma's running shoes, and Emma says, Nora, I've had these for years. Emma has the better memory between them. If pressed on a detail she can't recall, Nora sometimes jokes, I blacked that out on purpose, don't remind me. Emma watches her sister's fingers deftly pull the laces of her own shoes taut, first one, then the other, and it's like looking at her own hands, disembodied, but outside herself. "Look who's home," says a familiar voice, and they look up to see their next-door neighbor waving from the road, accompanied by her Cocker Spaniel, whose improbable name is Stephen. Nora goes to kneel on the pavement. "You sweet baby," she says, and strokes the animal's ears. "Emma," Mrs. Hoffman is saying, "I didn't think you'd be home for some time. How wonderful." She means this. Her broad smile is like light on water. In her blue windbreaker, she reminds Emma of one of the candles the yoga teacher lit in class to open everyone's throat chakras. She seems to flare comfortingly against the distant scenery of the beach. In the bend of the cove, visible over Mrs. Hoffman's shoulder, Emma can see the ocean hurling wave after wave up onto the shore with unusual violence, all spit and foam where normally protected water lies as placid as an animal sleeping. She shivers. Mrs. Hoffman is asking, "What brings you two home?" She bestows her smile on each of them, and Emma says, "We're here for our mother's birthday." Nora, loyal, only continues her professions of adoration to the dog. If she notices Emma's evasion, she makes no sign of it. I'll stop there.
So let's tell us. I love that story, and I feel like it's a perfect story for you to read because it captures a lot of the themes that are in many of your stories, specifically a young woman who is in the midst of figuring out her life and maybe not quite there.
Yeah.
I mean, Emma comes home after some, we don't really fully understand, like a mysterious reason that she's come back home. But I find so many of your characters, especially these lost women, so compelling and endearing because they're just really going through it. And you capture that feeling and that emotion of just like a little bit of self-loathing, a little bit of desire for something more, but like not knowing what it is. That oftentimes they don't really know what they want. And I'm wondering what it is about these characters and about that emotional state in life that you find compelling in writing.
Yeah.
Because you do write it so well.
Thank you. I didn't really set out to write about one's 20s, but I was in my 20s, so I feel like as I was like writing stories about, and I write sort of close to life, and
At a certain point, well, I want to hear about like your process of putting together a collection, but I feel like I was writing individual stories, and there was a moment where you're like, is this a book, and how do they all relate to each other? And at a certain point, friends reading. I think I was like trying to write about time and memory mainly, were like one of my thematic interests, but people started to, this is a book about being in your 20s, and I started to see that was true. And I do think like the emotions of that period of life, I think kind of left a very structured period, and then there's like a lot of, there's like a lot of possibilities, and so every choice feels like we're closing other possibilities, and so even something good can feel quite dire as a choice. So yeah, that's I think what interested me.
So when you were organizing, and we can talk about like the organizing of a collection, when you were compiling all of these stories, and you said time and memory was like initially we thought, this is what I'm writing about. When you're putting them together, and maybe other people were saying like this is about your 20s or just being in your 20s. How did you think about how you were going to organize it given like these thematic overlaps?
I feel like I reordered it many, many times, and every time it's like, it's done. Someone would be like, no. Or not even no, but someone would say, but what if it was like this? And then I'd sort of see their point. And I never thought about thematic ordering so much as just like mixing up first person and third person, and especially like at the beginning of one, or at the end of one story seems like an interesting lead into the next one, in the way that if you just read something, like should the next story kind of underscore what you just felt, or should it go in another direction? But how was it for you?
Similar. I also reordered mine a bunch of times, but like, wait, you said how many years did your story span when you were writing?
About 8 years.
8 years, yeah. So similarly, like mine was 9 years, and I didn't really know like what resonances there were with the stories because each one was its own separate thing. And then when I compiled them, I was like, oh, there are a lot of like thematic overlaps, or at least like tics or obsessions that I have as a writer. Yeah. So loveliness, ambition, relationships, like how we navigate what we owe to each other.
Yeah.
So then I was thinking, okay, I'm going to organize them like based off of those, like all the loneliness stories, all the like family stories, but that did not work out. Okay. It's like the same thing like in a row. It's like tiring for me even as a reader. So then I did kind of what you were doing, like the mixing it up. Yeah, I wrote like, what perspective is this told in? Is it like a flash piece? Is it longer? And then trying to like juxtapose the pieces. Even like the last note, thinking about like how like the last ending note of a story plays off of like the beginning of the next one.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
But so, no, you go.
Well, I was gonna say, like, how did you arrive at it? Because I think it's interesting with story collection because it is thematic by nature. Like, like you're saying, it can feel like you don't know what the connections are between stories because those obsessions are so natural to you and your way of doing the world. You're just kind of like, I struggle with stories. Like, I don't really know how they connect. And then, so how now at this point do you talk about what the collection's about, and is that different from how it was at a different place along the way?
I think it's changing even from event to event,
Yeah.
honestly. Yeah. Because sometimes I'll talk about it in terms of the loneliness aspect. Like a lot of these characters feel very alone in the world, whether or not they're like literally alone, like the first character alone in his house, and it's just like very much being consumed by that aloneness in the house and loving it, versus like another character who feels very, say, alone in her family or alone in a friendship because it's a friendship that is falling apart or has already fallen apart. But then other times, I've started to talk about it in terms of like death and loss, like literal death, which just, a lot of these stories do deal with grief in some way, but also the death of a time period, the death of a friendship, the death of like a certain time period in one's life, or the death of even like the idea of oneself that you carry with you and then have to let go of. Yeah. How has it evolved for you?
I think at the beginning I was like, what about time? But it is. I think I initially was writing about young women because it just felt like I was writing about things that sort of were out of my own experiences as like a jumping off point. But I think over time, including through the process of trying to publish these stories, it's become very important to me, like the urgency, I think, of telling stories in women's voices and seeing the ways that people are very comfortable being like, does the story, like I got a little bit of feedback at different points on the sort of professional submission parts of it where I get a little feedback like, does it matter? Like, why does it matter? And I got that really, I think, is like over time very galvanized by that it became very important to me that it's a collection about mostly young women talking about memories that have stuck with them in some way. Often something where someone might say, like, get over it, or people say to them a lot, like, calm down, take it easy, and those things all came in like kind of unconsciously. I wasn't. Then I look back at all the stories, oh my God, like in every story, someone says to someone who's women, calm down, or like, it's all, toughen up, or something like that. So now I think that I guess more in those terms too. That I feel urgency around, like, this being a book about women who go over and over and over a memory in many cases, and in as a way to try to understand why something that maybe other people are telling you isn't important actually is. Yeah.
I do see that like as an overlap in our work.
Yes.
In terms of like another way that I like will talk about the story is like people going through their day-to-day average lives.
Yes.
Most of them are just like dealing with the day-to-day mundane aspects of their lives, but it matters to them just like it matters to us like every day, these little tasks that we're doing, and for some reason some things will like stick in our minds more so than others. But I know
well, I was gonna ask you like about, how your experience was with writing a novel and now stories, and I'm going off
hopefully going now, the direction I'm working on a novel now. I feel like part of this persistent myth of like people don't want to read stories is perhaps that like when you've written a novel, there's like a plot to tell. People like, what's it about? And you're like, well, this, and this happens. And when with stories, like it's like almost something where if you could just say it, then there wouldn't need to be a story about it. So like when you're like, well, I wrote this book about people going through their day to day, and it's like, it won't matter to you, but it matters to them. It's like, it's so, the book is so beautiful, but it's very hard to sort of persuade people like of that, of the urgency.
Although I will say that my novel has a similar problem. Like, what is the plot of this? She goes about her life and she moves from this place to this place to this place, and then she has thoughts about it.
Well, I was gripped.
Love the plotless.
Love same. Which is why actually, that leads me to a question I want to ask. So, I worked on this sentence from the story Clara, which is about, we both have stories that are about the end of a friendship between young women. And in this story, the narrator says about it this night, she remembers, which was the last time they saw each other, right, with their two partners. And the story is kind of moving between the past and that evening, and at a certain point she says, it's strange how much that night haunts me despite very little having happened. And I have a story too where I feel like I wrestled for years with like knowing that I wanted it to read like a short story, but that it was a story about not getting resolution, and therefore like ultimately the story What Else Happened, which is about like a young woman who sort of reviewing the details of this semester when she feels that something kind of went wrong in her life, but she can't quite bring herself to say what it was. That has to do with like someone else's increasing possessiveness towards her, a friend's increasing possessiveness. So I am interested in like, I was wondering if you would talk about writing stories that where maybe, and I guess this is bringing it up because this relates to the plot, but you know, stories where one might say it's strange enough. It haunts me despite very little thing happen.
Yeah. I think those are the stories that I gravitate towards writing naturally.
Yeah.
Maybe because even though what she says, despite very little having happened, that's like in her mind almost trying to like talk herself out of it in a way, because a lot happens emotionally for her that night. It's a lot of interior and internal turmoil that she's trying to look back on and parse out, and like your characters try to understand like what happened emotionally to themselves in these like from the outside average periods of time. And maybe that's, I think structurally when writing a story about something like that, there's no, especially with that story, there's not as much like to latch on to in terms of plot points. Like it can't be like, and then like she showed up at the beach and like met this person and then they fell in love and then they lived happily ever after. It's more like, and then they saw each other and they kind of talked, but they didn't really, and then they separated and then they saw each other again, and this person was actually just living in their head most of the time. So structurally, it's really about like staying, or craft-wise, staying very internal in the character. And that story, similar to your story, like moves around in time a lot. Although I loved that last story first, by the way, because you can really feel the character, that narrator, like being evasive and like wanting to talk around the thing that maybe affected her the most. I think with my character, she does something similar where like she is evasive. She's like trying to come up with other storylines, other plot lines, and that's where the narration moves a lot. So I guess craft-wise, like just trying to figure out the structure to like match the character's state of mind.
Yeah. And how does the story end? It doesn't end with like getting
any
an answer or
resolution,
change, right? Because I think like there's all these things that we're told about stories about how something has to change, and like the reason a story exists is something changed. And I feel like our stories have in common because like a lot of them are about a time that something changed, but maybe no one else could see it, so they don't have to tell that story to themselves.
And I feel like, well, with your story, but I also think with my story is that like maybe what's changed is that they are looking back and dealing with it and like getting a tiny bit closer towards understanding that time period. I don't know if you think
Yeah.
about
I
your
do think,
stories
yeah, I
that
don't
way.
think that they all do, but I think the ones who like allow themselves to like keep obsessing over whatever thing obsesses them, like
Yeah.
eventually do reach some more understanding. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about structure because, well, correct me if I'm wrong, almost all of the stories are written in fragments.
They all have white space between
Yeah.
paragraphs, yes.
Yeah. Why include white space? Sometimes like the white space functions as like an actual break where you're moving from like one scene to another or from one time period to another. But then sometimes it's there like even when the scene is flowing.
And some of the first stories I wrote were very fragmentary, and so we really would jump from different points in time through, or back and forth in time. And then I just got very attached to it, and I just kept doing it, and it was very instinctive, and so I don't really have an answer, but there was a point in the production process when like they took the Word document and they laid it out, and they sent it back to me, and they were like, what do you think? And they had taken out all the white space, just by misunderstanding what was supposed to happen between them. No, and I was just like, I couldn't believe what a different, like, I guess I knew I was attached to the white space, but to actually see it, like, formatted as a book where everything, like, just, and they changed it. But yeah, I think, for whatever reason, I mean, like, I like fragments because I think, because of, like, this kind of, because my, like, sort of jumping off point was the idea of, like, how does memory live in the mind? How does the story come back to you and come back to you? I liked the way the fragments, like, allow the present and the past to like, coexist, and time kind of fits together, and the present makes you reevaluate your past, and the past, distracts you in the future, and so I think it was very, just seemed like instinctively the right way to kind of write about the way we kind of work. Yeah.
When you're writing, also, I mean, this is something, as you know, like my novel is very fragmented too. I was wondering if when you're writing, are you like moving fragments around also, or are you just naturally writing and then like adding that white space in? This is like my own curiosity.
Like some of them happen very quick, and some of them more slowly, but I do basically like each stepping stone, like it's pretty much not never, but like mostly they kind of the shape stays kind of the same. And then I tweak with it. What about you?
With the novel, it was very haphazard. Extremely haphazard. So I was just writing fragments that came to mind, and then I had like, I don't know, 50,000 words of fragments, and then I had to go back and be like, organize them in some sort of way. And I was like, let's organize them based off of place.
Okay.
And then fill in a lot of gaps and then constantly like moving stuff around, which I did not experience with the stories as much. Yeah.
So I have a question about relationship between your stories and your novel.
Okay.
Like one thing that Alexandra's novel does that's really interesting is I feel like it very purposefully plays with the gray area between fiction and life, and who is the author versus who is the narrator. So for example, there'll be the narrator speaks very explicitly about being engaged in the writing of a document that we gather as like what we're reading, and we'll sometimes write something and then talk to someone else on the next page and kind of be like here's a story from my mother's childhood, and then on the next page we'll kind of say I talked to my mother and she says it didn't go that way, it went this way, and so there's this constant rewriting of and really drawing you to think about what's true and what's not, and which I love. And then there's a moment where there's like a reveal about the name of the narrator that is like just such a stunning moment. And
Even like very last draft.
really,
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. So I was wondering, like, it seems to me that you were playing with them very explicitly in the novel. Tell me if I'm wrong. In the stories, do you feel like, did it feel like a completely different project? Did that concern feel related to the story in some way?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that in the novel I definitely was doing that, almost because I was drawing so much from my own life when I was writing it, and I anticipated that readers would read it almost like it was my life. And so in that way, it's like an invitation, like, yes, you might be right that like some of this is from my life, but this is also fiction, and putting that into question, like what is I mean, in all of the stories that we tell, what is like true versus what is something that like we have created through the way that we tell a story. But in the stories in this collection, I wasn't as concerned with that. And maybe that's because I wrote the novel like in the middle of writing these stories.
Okay.
And I put like a lot of that angst into the novel. And with the stories, each one was kind of its own thing, its own little project. There are some that definitely could be potentially read as like maybe a very similar narrator as in Days of Destruction. But I think of them as their own things. Yeah, and none of them get as meta as the novel does.
Okay,
Yeah.
So it feels like maybe that's graphic from that project.
Yes,
more than
yes,
all
yeah.
your work, right?
Yeah. Well, maybe.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Who knows?
I say things at events that I'm like, is that true? Is that not? These are always like things that are coming to mind as we're discussing and writing. But I am curious too, because you mentioned earlier that you also write from the lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
How does that work for you when you're? I mean, I'm always curious to hear from other writers who are drawing on like an autobiography or like things that actually happened, and the process of turning that into fiction, turning that into stories.
Yeah, so my like earliest sort of when I was like first really serious about writing, I was like an undergraduate and I was in a nonfiction writing program.
Oh,
Just
okay.
because I took this class, I liked the professor and I was like, I'll just keep doing this. And eventually I started to feel like certain confines of like just feeling like I wanted to. I got frustrated with having to stick so much to the truth, and I think at that age I felt so like, oh, I'm writing about as like being an undergraduate, like I'm just bored with this. So when I started writing fiction, I feel like I still began in the way I used to begin when I was like writing essays, but then I would just like it was like very liberal, it's just change whatever I felt like, and so a lot of the stories kind of like come from something true, but then they change and depart from the truth in many ways. But it's interesting to hear you talk about the decision. It's almost like I feel like, are you saying there's like a protectiveness of your own privacy in writing, almost like you're writing a story that you know people might see as true. So then you add things that make it very explicit, like it's not all true.
Yeah, it's like I'm aware.
Yeah.
You think that this is true. I mean, I invite it. I know it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think there is like an artfulness to I'm not speaking about my own book, but like people like Ocean Vuong, who wrote like a very, one might say, autofiction novel. And then some of my favorite, again, autofiction books, like Valerie Luiselli's Faces of the Crowd, Annalise Trent's So Many Olympic Exertions, all of them kind of do acknowledge that, like, yes, this is drawn from life, but that does not make it memoir. It's reaching for some other truth, I guess.
Yeah.
I like what you said where it's like the seed is something that actually happened, but then it departs.
Yeah.
Because the story oftentimes calls for something else. It's like, I want to follow this story where it wants to go, and not necessarily, I'm not trying to like map out my life and write out like how I truly interpret or felt.
Yeah, and you sometimes get to the emotional heart of it.
Yeah.
Like faster, not even faster, but just you can like get to a more tender place or something by being like, by pushing away the part that would be like, I have to tell this truthfully, other people who were there would like.
Right.
So I had the 3 stories about the family.
Yeah.
When I was writing the first one of those, it was like one of the early stories in the book that I wrote. And I like family, like I have one sister, and in the story it's a sister and brother. And I feel like I remember adding that brother because even from like the first 2 pages, I was like, anyone who knows me at this moment of my life could read this and sort of, so I'm relating to the impulse you're saying where I was like, feeling like just an almost to just put something in there that will obviously signal like it's not all true or something. But I think the result is that, but then people would say to me like in grad school, like, oh, I always thought you had a brother, like because of those stories. So I'm like,
Yeah.
in the way that things, they do kind of, I think they do feel there's like things in them where people can, it's like, where does that come from that people can kind of feel? Or people often say to me like, did you really break both your wrists?
Because there's that story that happened that never happened to me, but it happens all the time. That people
I think it's a reader impulse.
Yeah.
And I do think that it's, and I am definitely guilty of that too, where it's like, yeah, I wanted to ask you, do you have a brother? And it's like,
But like,
well,
why
why?
feel guilty
Why?
about it? But why feel guilty about it also?
yeah, that's
I don't
true. I guess because, well, I don't think most people feel guilty. To be honest. But I guess I do because I'm like, why? I don't want people to assume everything is super real, so why would I ever assume something like that of others? But I don't know. That's like the complicated, like outside of writing stuff.
Yeah.
I wonder about sometimes. I don't know. Do you wish the stories could exist separate from you? Where like,
No, I actually don't.
okay.
Like, I kind of like the interplay of,
okay,
I don't know. Like, I think because I like something I loved about your novels,
Yeah.
like I like that gray area. I think there's it's like there's something kind of exciting about
yeah,
the not knowing, people wondering.
yeah.
And I think in stories, because like they can't all be the same person, so it almost I
Mhm.
think it was a fun part about writing stories because they can't actually all be me at all. So they're all some part of me that then
Composites,
become like
right.
something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Do you
they
read-
become their own thing.
Do you read memoir?
Yeah.
And what's the
Well, I
experience
read
of reading?
memoir that's like sort of like lyric essay memoir, like
Okay.
auto-criticism and stuff. Yeah. I feel like anything else on art. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like that reading? And I say this just because I don't read that much memoir. Is that reading experience different than reading something that you're treating as out of fiction in your mind?
I feel like it. I normally feel like it kind of it's something I read when I want to like get inspired. Kind of. But I think like true memoir, which maybe true memoir, but
True.
like
Memoir is fiction too.
memoir that's like more direct prosy.
Yeah.
This is what happened. When I read that, that does feel different. I guess. Yeah. Yeah. How are we on? Can we answer a few more questions?
Okay. I wanted to ask you about.
Okay, so there's these two moments that I felt were resonance with things that I was reading about. I loved it. So we're gonna talk about them. So there's Clara in the story about two friends, sort of says to her friend at one point, some of us can have these romantic, idealistic lives, some of us
Yeah.
have more practical goals. And
Yeah.
really kind of like sort of says, I read this kind of like, you don't get to want the things you want, or I don't have to be responsible for the things that I want. And also the sentence in the last story, where someone right at the end, you're unlucky, you don't know how many people wish they could be you. So, as I said in my book, a lot of people's, there's like, so another friend moment where Christine says to Daisy, there are, you have a pretty good life. It could be worse. That's why he says
A lot of people tell your characters.
Yeah,
that
yeah,
they have
yeah.
good lives, like you're very well taken care of.
Yeah, and the mother says like,
Mhm.
not everyone has the privilege of sitting on the couch being sad, which
Yeah.
like people respond to that moment in very different ways, which is interesting. Some people are totally undersigned, some people are like, how dare she? So I'm just like interested in what do you think, like the impulse, is it like a human impulse, do you think, to tell people, to sort of put people in their place, kind of, do you think it happens to certain kinds of people, to the kind of person that these narrators are? Are they more sensitive to it? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's a deep
I know. I know.
I do think that once you're in an intimate relationship with someone, it almost is like the boundary between your two personhoods starts to blend, and I don't know, someone begins to like represent you and you represent them, and that's where I think there's that impulse of telling someone like, this is how you should live, or this is not how you should live, or you don't get to feel this way because it reflects somehow on them also. And that's something that I think just happens in some of our most intimate relationships. Like, I think in that story, Clara, there is like a little bit of toxicity in that, maybe not even a little bit, maybe a lot, in that friendship. And that's something that I think is very particular to that time period in their lives, being in their 20s or being in college. where they do feel like they're just like so close that they feel like they do own, have some sort of ownership over the other person. But I'm hopeful that that's not something that like these characters would like stay in for the rest of their lives. But to your point about like the kinds of people, maybe young women do get that more often than other people. I'm not really sure. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm with that. I think in between the friends in my book, I feel like it's well, I guess I just like in writing this book, I got actually noticed that we try to tell people like, why do we think that we can't like both feel differently or different values or priorities?
Yeah.
To be like, it kind of sounds like shaming to me. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, when she says, "We can't all do this," some of us are more practical adults.
Yeah. But actually, it can be nice to be idealistic. I don't know. I think it's something that is compelling in fiction because it's very complex, like that kind of relationship where someone feels like they have the right to tell you. That is a complicated relationship. Similarly, there are like parent-child relationship. That's probably like the most classic in my book too. But and that's the same thing in yours. The parents are often the ones who say some of the crueler things to their daughters who are going through what I read as like pretty depressive states.
Yeah, but I think it's like
But it's from like
I'm
almost
supposed to
like,
draw a line of like control almost. Like, it's gonna be
yeah,
fine.
yeah,
But I do think like, and I'm sure it's in any generation there are maybe those things, but I think between like I grew up in the 90s and
same.
yeah, and I feel like there was this like girl power thing.
Yeah.
And then I feel like I had like, so then coming of age sort of lacked in language to be like, it's something like, I feel like it's supposed to do with being a woman, but like, it sort of wasn't. I feel like when Me Too happened, it was like a moment of like, oh, it's like okay to be mad about like things that, or to be more overtly angry about things that used to sort of be like surface or something.
Yeah.
And I think, so I feel like when I was growing up, there was a little bit of a thing of like, maybe in my parents' generation, it was like, things are so great, like it's all fixed. There's a moment in the book when the father kind of says to the daughter, like,
that
feminism, like it's all on the upswing. Like I hire lots of women, like women don't have to worry about being held back anymore.
that was such a dad thing to say.
Yeah,
I hire lots of women. I was like
it's all good, calm down. And yeah, so it has happened in every generation, I think. But I feel like a lot of these characters are like telling these stories to themselves because they're like, okay, people are telling me that I shouldn't worry about this, but it keeps bothering me, so I kind of can't help but keep thinking about it, and they feel quite bad for still thinking about it, and they're kind of telling themselves they should be over it, but eventually kind of like work their way toward, by the end, more clarity about the world they're really living in than maybe what people wanted them
Yeah.
to live. Yeah.
It's making me think also that our books are very like millennial in that way. Because we are like of a generation that was told one thing and then like got something really different.
Yes, and then there's still this like hangover of like
Yeah.
relating to your parents and feeling like they sort of like broadly understand certain trends about why life is really different for a generation than theirs, but maybe on an individual basis that's like a much harder time. Kind of like actually one-on-one giving me that space. Or,
Yeah.
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 Do we want to? Should we open up
Yeah,
to Q&A on that note? On our depressing millennials.
Because it's a book about.
Oh,
I can say that. Because it's a book about being in your 20s, and now people in their 20s are Gen Z.
Oh
Or many
yeah.
of them are. I feel like there was this moment where my agent was kind of like, yeah, we're gonna like on the jacket flap. We're gonna be like Gen Z.
No. I feel like Gen Z
It's
has
very
even worse
different.
than us. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. But yeah, very open to any and all questions. If there are.
I think we're small enough where we can just.
Yeah, we can just
This doesn't
you don't
need
even
to
have
be
to raise your
formal.
hand. You can just say something.
So have you guys Did you just meet recently, or have you been together on a tour before?
It's our first time in person. We live in the same town, but during the pandemic. So when I read Alexandra's book, we were living in the same town. The book, so I knew from the book that she also lived in Africa.
Yeah.
And I waited and waited to reach out and say I loved your book because I was like, let's wait till it's like, we're allowed to like go outside and go on a walk or something. And then I wrote to her and she was like, can we get together? She was like, I moved away a week ago.
No, it's like, I am moving next week. I was like, I wish we could put like my
Yeah.
And we met very briefly at AWP.
Yeah,
in
really.
Philly. Yeah, it
We
really was.
we've exchanged emails.
Yeah.
But this is our
Yeah.
first in-person conversation.
This is our
Many years
first
of
time.
friendship.
You're so simpatico, and I haven't read either of your books yet, but I will. And it's just lovely how you seem to, from different voices and different perspectives, but you're kind of dancing in the same room. It feels like,
Yeah.
and dealing with some of the same issues. And I was really particularly interested in what you said about memoir, and when does memoir become autofiction, which is something I've been working on for a long time. And it's just and I wonder did either of you ever start out wanting to write memoir? Or did you want the freedom not to be bound by that?
Yeah.
And I always wonder how much of memoir is actually real.
I wonder too.
No, it's so
wonder too.
subjective and they're so.
I
Anyway.
think the rule of memoir is that you have to stick to your memory, understanding that memory is fallible and is so particular to like one person. And another person in the room could have a totally different memory of that situation. But I personally didn't even want to be bound to my own memory. I think fiction for me is a lot of the joy is where, I don't know, discovering where one sentence goes and what could follow. And that is like a big pleasure for me in writing. And I feel like being stuck, or I guess having to stick to my own memory would make me feel more stuck and constrained.
Such a good point. Yeah. Like, because there's something about the fun of finding out. Like, I've never outlined what I gather.
Yeah, me
you
neither.
But some people really do write that way. But I'm so in it for like finding out through the writing, like where kind of what it wants to be. And I do kind of believe in the like magical part of it where it shows you what it's turning into. And I feel like by the time I had the idea of a book, I was very much writing fiction, but I had written like some nonfiction memoirs things, but very much like individual pieces, and then I was writing individual short stories. And by the time I saw the book as a book, I was definitely writing fiction, I think. It felt exciting to. I don't know how to explain like why it felt like I was bored with writing. Like I was like, I'm 24, like I'm so bored with writing stories that just like I went to college and now I'm in New York and I'm feeling sad. And I was like, but if I write fiction about them, like I think then it was like a new way into these things that felt too frustrating sometimes. Like they felt like maybe they felt like not worthy of rising to level of memoir in terms of like a big important thing happens. I think by making them fiction, it was like, oh, now it's okay to write about these things because fiction is made of the everyday. Or something. Yeah.
No, and I loved what you said about you turned your sister into a brother, just so people would know that if anybody who knows me knows. Because it is that sort of, I remember Wallace Shawn saying to me, be very, very careful if you ever consider writing memoir, because you really have to understand how people on the other end of this are going to be affected by it.
Yeah.
And there's also the issue you were talking about privacy. And by doing autofiction, you have the ability to go into these places that are just so much freer and more open and can do magical realism and all sorts of things that
You can also tell the true story and be like, it was fiction.
Right.
Like there is one whatsoever. Well, there's one story in my book that basically like it's all true, but it's in a book of fiction, and so no one will ever know which one's the one, you know.
Can I let you do both?
I was going to say, can I ask, do you think of an ideal reader? Because it's interesting when you're writing a novel, you thinking about who might want to read this book or this story. There's obviously short stories, there's a number of different ways into them, and they may have a theme across the whole collection. But so do either of you or both of you have someone in your head as you're writing or putting the collection together, think this is the kind of ideal reader, or is it really more that the stories go where they are and let people whoever take out on what they want to
I feel like I don't know if it's an ideal reader, as much as I don't know, just like very much going. This is not a very interesting answer because it's mysterious, but I'm just like going on and thinking about what feels like compelling, and then I think people come to it or find it, need to find it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think with the novel, I did have, I guess I was writing to my taste. And I thought of, okay, like me 5 years ago or whatever, what kind of book did I like to read and did I want to read? So I guess I thought of myself as an ideal reader, but not in the sense that like, I'm just only writing for myself. I just felt like there were other readers like me out there.
Absolutely.
And so that's who I was thinking about.
Yeah,
and
I
taste
like
wise,
that
like,
too. Yeah. And I guess like I imagine one thing that's been gratifying is I feel like I imagined almost that it would like I thought, oh, I'll have like an agent who's like kind of my age, and I'll have an editor who's kind of my age, and like it'll just be for people who are like just like me, kind of. And I think it's been really cool to see how it resonates with women of other generations. That surprised me and feels that that was really interesting. And then moments where I guess I feel like older men are the hardest to. I mean, the Jack Flap sort of says it's about like young women figuring out their lives in their 20s, but then once in a while, like my parents' neighbor just loved it, and I was like so moved by that. Because I most of the older guys can so little last to have any interest in something. So it's interesting how that ideal reader kind of expands too.
It's really unpredictable.
Yes,
like
yes.
where the book will go.
Yeah.
But it's in the writing that's like, I guess I'm guessing you write to your own taste, like we all write to our own taste,
yeah.
and then hope that people
Like
will resonate with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
A related question: do you feel like you're part of any sort of literary tradition or movement? When I was in particular, I read a lot of like Asian American immigrant short story collections, flourishing like tiny little stuff.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're part of anything, or maybe you distinguish yourself in some ways?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the first short story collections that I really loved were by Asian American women or Asian women. So Alexandra Chang, who teaches at Iowa, I randomly found her story collection, and that book is very much about immigrants and children of immigrants, and that's something that I'm definitely concerned with in my own stories. And then Ian Lee, I love her short stories, but those writers are, I also think of them as like elders. They are people who are of a different generation, and so they write about Asian and Asian American experiences in a different way than say like people my age and my contemporaries. So I do think of myself in this like long lineage, but very much in conversation with writers who are working today too, or similar age. Like let's say Shruti Swami's Houses of Body is a really wonderful story collection. That came out in 2020. Asako Serizawa's Inheritors is also another collection that like I think about all the time. And what's so exciting, I think about being a young Asian/Asian American writer today is that there are so many people you can be in conversation with and who are working in such different styles and different genres, but there is like, I don't know, a lot of diversity now, whereas before it might have only been like the kind of Lexicon Kingston, the Woman Warrior type book, which I also love.
You know, maybe say like feel in a lineage of women writing, and then some of them are essayists. Like I think I'm kind of some of my early essayists. I mean, the Joan Didion very early on when I was experimenting. Women who are writing about what happens in day to day. I think that's why your work resonated so immediately with American Women I read with, but who, treat that as very worthy of a subject matter, if not second tier.
Do you like Miss Berlin? Okay. That's my only question. I'm thinking like other there's so many short story writers who have influenced my work as well that are not like only in this Asian American lineage, but like Lucia Berlin, Grace Paley, like Lydia Davis, these people who are doing like very experimental things in their work.
Yeah. And I think when you're writing short stories, like you do feel this also like just such a kinship with people who are writing that right now as well, because it is such a sort of embattled form, strangely.
It really is.
Even though it's not, like it's so alive and well. We're writing them, people are reading them, but it's just like sort of like when you're publishing them, people are just always sort of telling you like, by the way, like if it's not focused on the table next to a novel, like everyone will pick the novel. It's like, okay. So yeah, it's
So thank you for caring about short stories.
Yeah. Anything else?
I'm kind of curious, you guys were talking at the beginning of the conversation about the length of time in which these questions were assembled. I was very curious, like, did you ever find yourself disagreeing with perhaps the way you framed something a long time ago? Or even just the thoughts that you had?
I did. Yeah.
And so would you make those stories or no?
I think what I found really fascinating was seeing, so one of the ways I wanted to organize the collection was chronologically at first, just so I could see like, ooh, my trajectory as a writer, how have I changed, how have I grown? But I didn't like having all the old stories first because they were ones that felt distant to me when I was reading them. Like maybe I didn't love the way that I had captured something, but I still respected it for the story. And I still think it works for the story, even if I would not necessarily write that story today. So I've tried to embrace the whole like process over product mentality. Like this is hopefully a long-ish journey as a writer. And not every piece is going to be perfect. It's going to just like show one piece of the process as, I don't know, on my path as a writer, I guess.
I love that.
Yeah. I think, I stole that from, can't even remember, but somebody was talking about process over product.
Yeah.
Gosh,
I like
have
feel
to
like I
introduce
just love that in the
somebody.
context of putting a collection together. I feel kind of the opposite. Yeah, I still feel like pretty like when I read any of them again, I feel sort of feel a lot for the character and I think I sat with them all over so many years. Like I just feel like I come up, down, so like resonating from different times of life. I made changes accordingly over time, I think. So yeah, as a whole, like yeah, it's a cool question.
Sort of dropping off that, but if I understood correctly, Alexandra, you were saying that you sort of were working on the book of short stories and the novel happened in the middle.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can just talk a little about that in light of that question, like how that impacted coming back to, were you thinking of the stories as a collection already before the novel happened? Were you still in that phase of just kind of writing stories that you weren't sure if you were putting together?
Yeah, I do think I had to force myself to think of the stories as a collection when I started querying agents. Because I'd be like, I am working on a novel and a collection of stories. But because I had written the novel in the middle and it came out also like in the middle, I think I wrote maybe 4 or 5 new stories after the novel. I do think that the novel really shifted what I wanted to write about and shifted how I thought about stories. And that's why I say like some of these older stories, I don't think I would write them today because after the novel, I just had different interests and I don't know, I put so much of myself, not only like, my lived experience, but like just so much of my own energy and time into this novel that I do think I've changed as a writer afterwards. And I think I had to approach the collection of stories just understanding that the older ones were not written by the same person. And some of them I read and I was like, wow, cool. That's actually pretty good. I wouldn't be able to pull that off today. But also others, like, yeah, as I mentioned, it's not something I would write necessarily today. But I still appreciate it for what it is and for what it represents.
Sorry, this is a bit of a greedy question, but are there any like specific examples that come to mind? In particular? It's a good building.
Yeah, we can talk more about it also after the cameras are up. Like, this is going on the internet. That's for record.
Do you feel like I did one of my events a few weeks ago with a memoirist, and she was quite adamant in a very funny way. She was very adamant, like writing is not therapeutic. If I want some therapeutic, I go to therapy. But I really resonate with what you're saying about like maybe I'll add on to your question about like. So I really still feel like a lot of connection to these narratives, but I also feel like by finishing this book, I sort of put a period of life aside, and I tried to write a version of a novel that was very much about also this period of life, and it was very frustrating. And I think that's just this kind of was the summation of what I had to say about that, and it was trying to kind of move on to the next thing. And it sounds like for you, that happened kind of in the middle of your story writing trajectory in this book. So sounds like you feel that kind of the writing process of changes you in some way.
Yeah, it does change you. I don't know if it's like therapeutically beneficial. I'm like, did I become a worse person after that? Maybe you're like a less healthy person. I don't know.
I think maybe therapeutic in the terms of like not good or bad, but playing to
Letting
terms
go.
with things or
Yeah.
working with a theme or
Yeah. Like, I don't want to write about this.
That,
It's like, I don't know how many people I read, but it's like very interracial relationship focus. Yeah, no, I just feel like I'm done with that in fiction, not in life. Shall we? Yeah. Do you want one more anything, or should we wrap it up?
Yeah. It was like, I guess you had mentioned that like it's like not easy to publish like a quick story and like it's kind of like a creative thing. So I guess I was wondering like how different is like the final product as it's released now from like a switch. Like ideally would have it feel like.
I don't feel like it's so. I don't feel like it like sort of the challenging part was like the challenging part is. I don't feel that it was like changed in bad ways that I had to like let go of certain ideals in order to publish it. What I feel is that like I had to get a really thick skin about like people sort of saying to you all the time like this is just casually just like no one wants to read those and that could be just quite discouraging at certain moments. So I kind of learned to let that roll off me. But I think I don't know, what was your experience?
I think I've been very lucky, and most writers I know are pretty lucky to have editors and agents who are very supportive of them writing the work in the way that they want and editing. I mean, of course, they're always helping us with editing, but
Ultimately, they say these are your decisions.
Yeah.
Like these are this is my
You can
perspective, and
decide.
in the end, you decide. Yeah.
but similar to Kate, it's more just like stories are hard. Stories are hard is a thing that we hear a lot. Or like, well, I don't care about stories. Obviously, we care about stories, and there are people who care about stories. But I've definitely heard of publishers who are, and I've also had offers that were like, just the novel, no stories. And then you just have to go into those relationships very intentional. Like, I only want to work with someone who does care about these stories because I care about them as well.
I think because the upside is because they feel like they're taking, in their terms, they feel like they're taking a risk on stories. Like they are very invested in it at the point where they finally, sort of make the leap. I think it's hard for editors. It's harder for some reason
to like for editors and who just maybe take a leap on stories versus novel. But then when they do, I think it's because they're very invested, it's not because they thought, oh, maybe it's a good business decision, you know. So
it's
so
probably
that
not a
that
great
part is
business
really great.
decision.
Yeah.
And I think of them probably as, they probably think of them as like projects that they really care about very much. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah,
This was
thank
really
you so
fun.
much.
Thank
This
you.
has been so much. Okay, yeah, let's go. We're happy to sign books if you want to sign books.